The Rayman series is a much-loved series of games. People love Rayman and they love talking about Rayman. In fact, I haven't been doing these reviews for very long and my audience is very small, but even I've had a viewer ask me to look at the Rayman games. I'm always hearing about how great they are. They're classics, they're incredible, they're loads of fun, and if you're lucky, they might even suck you off. But despite hearing the constant praise and also owning a game called Rayman Origins, I know nothing of this series. I'm completely in the dark and I don't know what's going on. And that just makes me all the more curious. The thought of getting to experience a beloved series of games that I personally know nothing about got me all excited and left a nice fizzy feeling in my throat. So I was keen to get amongst it, starting with the first game in the series, Rayman. Will this game live up to all the hype? Or will it betray my expectations like a chocolate-covered sprout? Let's crack on and see if Rayman is any good. We begin with the beginning. Already, this game is breaking new ground in the world of video games. Rayman has your classic sort of story for a platformer. It's simple, it's straightforward, it was probably inspired by a fever dream. Mr. Dark, who is this game's generic bad guy, defeats Batilla the Fairy and steals the Great Protoon, which is this weird pink orb that is somehow responsible for all the peace and balance in the universe. The Electoons, which are related to the Great Protoon in a way that is not explained, then end up scattered all over the world and captured by Mr. Dark's minions. The peace and balance of the world have been disturbed, and it's up to the totally unrelated character Rayman to rescue the Electoons and recover the Great Protoon from Mr. Dark. There's not really much to say about the plot of this game. Platformers, especially ones from this era, don't often have plots that are deep or meaningful, and this game is no exception, but it's a decent enough excuse to make the player move Rayman from point A to point B, so I'm not going to complain. It gets the job done. Speaking of, let's talk about the experience of moving Rayman from point A to point B. Rayman is a 2D platformer. You might remember the genre from such popular games as Super Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Donkey Kong Country. You control Rayman, who appears to be a human-like creature without any arms, legs, or neck. I wonder what holds him together. Perhaps Rayman and his disembodied head, feet, and hands are a metaphor for teamwork and collaboration, that individually we're only capable of so much, but when different people with different qualities come together, we can achieve something truly magnificent. Or maybe Rayman is supposed to represent that the things that bring people together are not physical, but rather they cannot be seen and are spiritual and emotional. Or maybe the developers thought it would be funny for the main character to have no limbs. Whatever the case may be, you control Rayman, and the aim of the game is to traverse 2D levels fraught with danger and rescue whatever Electoons you can find. My initial impression was that the gameplay was fairly generic. It seemed to be a relatively standard 2D platformer. There wasn't really anything that jumped out at me as being interesting. Rayman's initial moveset is simply walking, jumping and crawling, and also being able to pull a funny face. I feared that that was all Rayman had to offer and that the game would end up being boring. But over the course of the first world, I quickly realised how wrong I was. They say first impressions are the most important, but they never say that first impressions are the least accurate. After the first few levels, I understood the format. The game starts out extremely basic, but as you complete levels, Rayman gains new abilities that add more and more layers to the experience. What started out as a simple biscuit base evolved into an elaborate and rich cheesecake that was absolutely delicious. Rayman starts off only able to walk, jump, crawl and stick his tongue out, but as you progress, you slowly build up an arsenal of various moves that take the gameplay to the next level, such as punching, hanging from ledges, helicopter hair, and would you believe, running. Rayman controls very well, and his impressive range of moves is implemented effectively. He's very comfortable to play as. Sometimes older games like this have a slipperiness or a clunkiness that just makes you want to vom, but that's not a problem here. The gameplay here is solid, it was engaging, it kept me on my toes, and it was also surprisingly difficult. For the first world, I was almost shocked by the level of challenge. That is not the sort of realization I was expecting to have in level 3. This game does not go easy on you, and I respect that. It was hard, but it wasn't unfair, and that's the type of challenge that I love. I thought, this game is going to chew me up and spit me out, and I am here for it. The level design I thought was also generally really good. Each level is well structured, they flow nicely, they each offer something different, and they're very dynamic. You don't know what to expect really. Standard platforming, a chase level, a tower escape level, a level where Rayman is given a temporary new power. There's a lot of cool stuff on offer here. It was in the second world where this game really started to put me through the ringer. The platforming challenges started to dial up in difficulty, and the enemies, especially those green moth things, became tougher to deal with. As a result, I lost quite a few lives here, and this is where I make my first complaint. I don't really like how the life system is handled in this game. On the surface it seems pretty standard. If you die you lose a life, if you lose all your lives you get a game over, and you're kicked back to the last time you saved. That's totally fine. What I don't like is that this game also has a continue system. If you get a game over you can use a continue to restore some lives and keep playing, which sounds great. However, you only get 5 continues to start with and there is no way to earn any more. That's all you get for your entire playthrough. So if you end up in the situation that I ended up in, what will happen is you'll save your game with 0 continues and 1 life, meaning you have to make it through the entire next level without dying and getting another game over, or else you'll have to start the whole level over again. Because for some reason when you get a game over, you don't get given more lives. Instead, you're left with whatever number of lives you saved with, which was often a low number. And this game isn't easy, you're going to die a lot, so that is a brutal punishment. On top of that, it's very difficult to earn lives in this game. Sure, collecting 100 of those blue orbs sounds easy enough, but the counter resets to 0 with each death, so it's a lot harder than it seems. This caused a lot of frustration for me. I don't see why you would implement a continue system, but not implement a way to earn more, while also making it difficult to gain lives. It's a system that brutally punishes the player without really allowing you to overcome it. Maybe I should have opted to use the password system over the memory card, that might have made a difference, but it doesn't really excuse this whole mess. It pissed me off, I'll be honest, but I was still largely enjoying the game. It was difficult in a way that was fair, and I was keen to keep playing. I was also particularly fond of the game's presentation. It had great music, and the weird and wacky level themes amused me as well. You've got levels based on musical instruments, levels based on stationery. It's fantastic. Definitely a lot more interesting than what every other game does, where it's generic jungles, deserts, and snowy mountains. As far as environments and presentation is concerned, Rayman is certainly a unique specimen. Despite getting frustrated at the whole life system, the first half of the game has been brilliant. It's fun, it's presented nicely, it's difficult, but it's fair. It seems to have the makings of a top-tier platformer, and I was very much enjoying it. Sorry folks, this apparently can't last, because the second half of the game is where everything starts to fall apart. What started out as a really solid game had turned into a complete shit show. Remember how I was praising this game for being difficult but fair? Well, that's out the fucking window now, because in the second half, Rayman becomes a game about pure and utter cruelty. For some reason, in the second half of the game, Rayman decided to make a shift from genuine difficulty to artificial difficulty. When I noticed this, the game started to remind me of Donkey Kong Country. You see, Donkey Kong Country has this issue where the game is difficult, but not always in a way that's fair. It often relied on cheap shots to prevent the player from progressing. For example, what would happen is, you'd be making your way through a level and all of a sudden, an enemy would randomly fall from the ceiling and kill you. There's no tell that warns you that something like that is going to happen, it just happens, leaving you with a split second to react and avoid it, and most of the time you won't be able to. Most of the time, you'll die. Rayman takes those cheap shots and dials them up to 11. You would not believe some of the shit this game tries to pull. Not only do enemies randomly swoop in and kill you, just like in DKC, but hazards will also suddenly spawn in without warning. Whether it's fiery rocks that randomly appear and kill you, or it's an enemy that suddenly spawns directly in front of you, this game, particularly in the second half, will do whatever unfair bullshit it feels like to stop you from progressing. The game is full of trial and error. There was a little bit of this early on in the game, but it wasn't as egregious as it is towards the end. Some of the levels in this game are too heavily built on trial and error. There are levels where there is just no way you're ever going to be able to complete it without dying a few times. You're pretty much forced to die just so you can figure out what it is you're meant to do. There are levels where you move around at high speed and you have to react to oncoming hazards that quickly come in from off screen. There are levels where you're somehow expected to know when hazards and enemies are suddenly going to spawn in front of you and react accordingly. There are levels where you're required to make leaps of faith that often put you in danger. There are levels where the way forward literally isn't even there until it spawns in front of you. and you have to follow it as it appears. Literally pure trial and error. There's one level where Rayman is trapped under a falling stone, and to be able to survive the whole ordeal, you need to use Rayman's helicopter hair to cut the ropes pulling the stone down. At no point does the game imply that that's what you're required to do, or even that the helicopter hair has any function besides helping Rayman glide around. You're just expected to know that that's what needs to happen. How the hell are you supposed to figure that out on your own? Do you have any idea how many lives I wasted trying to work out what the game wanted from me? I had to look up how to get past that section. That's how bad it got. And you know what? Helicopter hair is fucking stupid anyway. What kind of a dumbass power is that? Helicopter hair? Why doesn't Rayman just spin his cock around to fly? That makes just as much sense as everything else in this bastard game. Oh wait, he can't even do that because he has no fucking body. When it comes to dealing with bosses and major enemies, trial and error is the name of the game once again, because you're basically forced to waste lives just learning what the boss's attack patterns are. Poor old dickless Rayman has to get repeatedly beaten to a pulp just to know how to deal with these bosses. They have no problem moving about the screen however they feel like, and throwing out attacks you wouldn't possibly be able to predict and avoid without having seen them before. It's not made any easier by the fact that the bosses can be brutally difficult anyway. Space Mama in particular can fuck right off. She rinsed me more than that washing machine has rinsed in its entire existence. I often complain about boss fights and platforms being way too easy, and I like them to be tough, but they shouldn't be tough in a way that feels rigged. You should at least be able to stand a chance. There's also that room before the battle with Mr. Scops, in which you're somehow supposed to know exactly which platforms are going to disappear, what his movements are going to be, and when the lava will decide to suddenly rise, just so you can simply survive. Predicting all this is completely impossible. It's total bullshit. I honestly cannot believe how much trial and error they crammed into the arse end of this game. What makes the whole thing worse is that the trial and error and the unfairness of it all plays directly into the cruelty of the life system. Because you're wasting your lives trying to figure out what the fuck is going on, and because in my own personal scenario, I never had more than 3 lives at a time, you're constantly getting game overs, meaning you're constantly having to restart levels from the very beginning. With each game over, you're only getting a little bit further along than you did previously. You have to keep replaying and learning the level inside and out, just to be able to get through it a single time. It got to the point where I resorted to using save states, just so I could actually make some decent progress. Now to be clear, I only used save states in locations where the game would respawn me if I died, so that's the beginning of level sections and checkpoints. But the fact that it even got to the point where I needed to use them just goes to show how brutal the game was getting. It was frustrating. Nevertheless, I persisted. The trial and error and general unfairness was infuriating, but there was still plenty of solid, fair gameplay to be enjoyed, so I kept on playing. I wanted to see this through to the end, because even though it's clearly got issues, this is a good game. After making it through the peacefulness of the Dream Forest, the rhythmic charm of Bandland, the serenity of the Blue Mountains, the bizarreness of Picture City, and the eeriness of the Caves of Scops, I was ready to face off against Mr. Dark in the final level. The only problem was, I couldn't access it. It turns out that in order to access the final level and actually beat the game, you need to go back through every single level and free all the Electoons from their cages. There's 6 in each level, and there are 17 levels. That's over 100 cages. Sure, I broke some as I went along, but there were still quite a few that I missed. To beat the game, I would have to go back through all the levels I've already beaten and beat them again, this time breaking all the cages. I would essentially be playing the game a second time. But did I soldier on and do it anyway? Of course I fucking didn't. Not only would breaking all the cages mean I'd have to put up with the unfairness and brutality I was just complaining about all over again, but it would also mean that I'd have to deal with the game's outrageous secrets. There really is no logic to any of it. Some cages are placed out in the open where the player can see them, and that's fine. But others are hidden behind ridiculous secrets that a first-time player like myself would never be able to figure out. Honestly, the secrets are a lot like the trial and error in the sense that there's pretty much no way to tell what's going on. There were some cages that I accidentally stumbled upon, and they completely baffled me. Sometimes, as you're just making your way through a level, landing on a specific platform or hanging from a specific ledge or jumping in a specific location will for some reason cause a cage to appear. There's no rhyme or reason for it, the game doesn't always allude to the presence of a secret, you're just expected to scour every inch of every level, hoping to randomly stumble across a secret cage while simultaneously dealing with the game's fuckery. To put it simply, I'm not doing that shit. Unfortunately, that means I won't be able to rescue Batilla the Fairy and recover the Great Protoon from Mr. Dark, and the contents of that final level will remain a mystery to me. Who knows, that might have been the greatest level to ever exist in any platformer and I'll never get to play it. Truly one of the greatest tragedies of our time. Joking aside, it is genuinely a shame that the end of the game is locked behind the requirement of freeing all the Electoons, because I really would have liked to see this whole thing through to the end. But I guess it just wasn't meant to be. Well played, Mr. Dark, you win. I think it's about time we wrap this up and answer the question I posed at the beginning of all this. Is Rayman any good? There's a lot to consider with this. Rayman has a lot going for it. The fundamental gameplay is fantastic. It's simple, but it's very enjoyable and comfortable. Most of the levels are very well designed. They each offer something different, they're dynamic, and they're usually fair. The game is presented brilliantly, the environments look great, and there are some pretty unique and distinctive themes. The music is excellent as well. It's a very solid game. But unfortunately, it does have some major problems that caused quite a bit of frustration. The whole continue system is just dumb. I don't like it, and I think they should have just stuck to simple lives and game overs. The game's secrets are ridiculous, and really put me off trying to properly finish the game. But the big issue this game has is, well, it's bullshit. The amount of unfair level elements such as randomly spawning hazards and enemies, as well as the unbelievable amounts of trial and error, made me genuinely furious at times. The fact that it caused me to resort to save states should really tell you everything. I almost never do that. Because of all this, what I'm left with is generally positive feelings, but some pretty big gripes as well. Rayman overall is a great game. I enjoyed it immensely and there's a lot that it does well, but the problems it has were a real kick in the balls for me and became more and more apparent the longer I played the game. Playing Rayman was like eating some deliciously sweet ice cream that gets slightly more bitter with every bite. But is Rayman any good? Absolutely. I think its problems are very obvious and very frustrating and can sour the experience, but overall I had a good time. And that's really what games are all about. I would recommend Rayman to anyone who wants to try out a classic platformer, anyone who wants to enjoy some generally solid gameplay, and also anyone who wants to experience a stress-induced heart attack.